Jung's most terrifying discovery wasn't about mental illness or unconscious complexes. It was about individuals who possessed what he called dangerous vision. People who could see psychological patterns, future outcomes, and hidden truths, with such clarity that it became a curse rather than a gift. In his clinical practice, Jung documented patients with what he termed hyperconscious perception. Individuals who saw through deceptions instantly, predicted disasters months before they occurred, and perceived the shadow contents of everyone around them with devastating accuracy. They saw the lies people told themselves, the relationships doomed to fail, and the psychological breakdowns waiting to happen. Jung called this discovery terrifying because these visionaries consistently ended up isolated, tormented, and unable to live normal lives. Not because their visions were false, but because seeing too much truth had become a psychological prison that separated them from human connection and condemned them to witness suffering they were powerless to prevent. Their gift of vision had transformed into what Jung described as the burden of unwanted prophecy, knowing what others refused to see and being helpless to change what they saw coming. Today, I'll reveal Jung's most terrifying discovery about people who see too much and why he believed this dangerous gift either drives individuals to madness or transforms them into something beyond ordinary human consciousness. Seers, who serve evolution itself. Before we continue exploring this revolutionary discovery, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our deep psychology content. Leave your like to support the work and comment which aspect of this topic resonates most with you. Now let's dive into the discovery that changed everything. The case that revealed Jung's most terrifying discovery began with a patient he described in his private notes as the woman who saw endings before they began. This patient came to Jung in 1918 during his intensive study of what he called precognitive psychological patterns. She was a highly intelligent individual who had spent her entire life tormented by visions of future events, relationship disasters, and personal breakdowns that invariably came to pass exactly as she had foreseen them. But Jung quickly realized he wasn't treating someone with delusional thinking or psychotic symptoms. He was observing something far more mysterious and disturbing. Jung wrote, "The patient presents with what can only be described as extraordinary psychological vision. She perceives patterns, outcomes, and hidden motivations with such accuracy that her predictions prove correct with alarming consistency. However, this faculty appears to cause her immense suffering rather than providing any practical advantage." This patient would walk into social situations and immediately see which relationships were built on deception, which marriages were headed for divorce, and which individuals were on the verge of psychological breakdown. She could sense when someone was lying about their feelings, when a business venture was doomed to fail, and when family dynamics were about to explode into crisis. But most tormentingly, she was usually powerless to prevent the disasters she saw coming. Jung observed that when she tried to warn people about what she saw, they would dismiss her insights as negativity, jealousy, or mental instability. When she tried to help individuals avoid the mistakes she could see them making, they would become defensive and cut off contact with her. When she attempted to prepare herself for disasters she knew were coming, she would be accused of creating problems where none existed. Jung wrote, "The patient has become trapped in a prison of unwanted knowledge. She sees clearly what others cannot or will not see, but this clarity has isolated her completely from human connection. She cannot share her insights without being rejected, and she cannot ignore them without being tormented by witnessing preventable suffering." But Jung discovered something even more disturbing about this pattern. Because this patient's visions were consistently accurate, she had lost faith in human consciousness itself. She could see how people deceived themselves, how they ignored obvious warning signs, and how they repeated destructive patterns with stunning consistency. Jung realized he was witnessing what he would later term vision burden syndrome, condition where extraordinary perception becomes a source of existential despair rather than wisdom. Jung wrote in his personal notes, "There exists a category of individuals whose consciousness has developed beyond the collective level, allowing them to perceive patterns and outcomes that remain invisible to ordinary awareness. But this advanced perception isolates them in a reality that others cannot access or validate, creating profound existential loneliness." Therefore, Jung began investigating what he would call the psychology of dangerous vision. He discovered that individuals with hyperconscious perception weren't randomly gifted with these abilities. They had developed them as survival mechanisms in response to early trauma or unstable environments. Their vision had emerged as psychological protection, but had grown so powerful that it became a burden rather than a benefit. Jung wrote, "The dangerous gift of vision often develops in individuals who required extraordinary perceptual abilities to navigate chaotic or deceptive environments in their formative years. But what begins as survival adaptation can evolve into perceptual abilities that exceed practical utility and become sources of isolation and despair." Modern research by Dr. Judith Orloff on intuitive development validates Jung's early observations about individuals with extraordinary perceptual abilities. Her studies show that highly intuitive people often develop their abilities in response to early environmental instability, but these abilities can become overwhelming without proper integration. But Jung identified something more specific and more dangerous within his psychological typology: the development of vision so powerful that it separates individuals from collective human experience. Jung observed that people with dangerous vision often possessed what he called pattern recognition beyond conscious utility. They could see psychological, social, and even material patterns with such clarity that they lived in a constant state of knowing outcomes before they manifested, understanding motivations that others kept hidden, and perceiving truths that others actively avoided. Jung wrote, "The individual with dangerous vision lives simultaneously in present reality and future probability, seeing not just what is, but what will inevitably become. This double awareness creates a form of psychological time displacement that makes normal human engagement nearly impossible." Jung identified 4 distinct types of dangerous vision that burden individuals with unwanted knowledge. Type 1, the relationship prophet. Jung documented individuals who could see the entire trajectory of relationships within moments of observing the people involved. These visionaries could instantly identify which couples were compatible versus which were headed for disaster, which friendships were authentic versus which were based on mutual exploitation, and which family dynamics were healthy versus which were toxic. Jung wrote, "The relationship prophet possesses extraordinary insight into human connection patterns. But this knowledge becomes a burden because they cannot engage authentically with relationships they know are doomed, yet they cannot prevent others from entering or remaining in destructive dynamics." These individuals would meet couples and immediately see the fundamental incompatibilities that would eventually destroy the relationship. They could identify the specific triggers, timing, and methods through which the breakdown would occur. But when they tried to share these insights, they were invariably dismissed as cynical, jealous, or destructive. Most tormentingly, relationship prophets often found themselves unable to form intimate connections because they could see the potential problems, disappointments, and endings in every relationship they considered entering. Type 2, the disaster. Predictor. Jung identified individuals who could sense impending disasters, personal, professional, and even collective, with uncanny accuracy. These visionaries would experience overwhelming anxiety or dread before accidents, business failures, health crises, and social upheavals that would manifest exactly as they had sensed. Jung wrote, "The disaster predictor lives in a state of perpetual anxiety about future catastrophes they can sense but cannot prevent. They become Cassandras of personal and collective tragedy, cursed with knowledge that others dismiss until it's too late to avoid the predicted outcomes." These individuals would sense when someone was about to lose their job, develop a serious illness, or experience a major life crisis. They could feel the energy building toward natural disasters, economic collapses, or social conflicts. But their warnings were typically dismissed as pessimism or anxiety until the predicted events actually occurred. Jung observed that disaster predictors often became paralyzed by their own visions, unable to make decisions or move forward because they could see too many potential negative outcomes in every choice. Type 3. The shadow seer. Jung documented individuals who could perceive the hidden shadow contents of everyone around them, the repressed desires, secret motivations, and unconscious destructive impulses that people kept carefully concealed from themselves and others. Jung wrote, "The shadow seer perceives not just what people present consciously, but what they hide unconsciously. They see through every facade, detect every deception, and recognize every repressed impulse. This creates profound isolation because they cannot relate to others' surface presentations when they see the hidden reality beneath." These visionaries could instantly identify when someone was being deceptive, manipulative, or self-deluded. They could sense hidden addictions, secret affairs, repressed anger, and unconscious motivations that drove behavior. But this knowledge made authentic social interaction nearly impossible because they were constantly aware of the discrepancy between people's conscious presentations and their unconscious reality. Shadow seers often became cynical about human nature because they saw how consistently people deceived themselves and others about their true motivations and desires. Type 4. The pattern integrator. Jung identified the most burdened category of visionaries, individuals who could see patterns across multiple dimensions simultaneously: psychological, social, temporal, and even what Jung called archetypal. Patterns that connected personal experiences to collective unconscious contents. Jung wrote, "The pattern integrator possesses vision so comprehensive that they perceive the interconnections between individual psychology, collective behavior, historical patterns, and archetypal dynamics. This creates overwhelming awareness of how personal actions connect to broader consequences across time and collective development." These individuals could see how personal psychological patterns reflected larger social dynamics, how current events connected to historical cycles, and how individual choices would impact not just immediate outcomes, but broader evolutionary development. But this comprehensive vision became paralyzing because they could see the vast complexity and interconnectedness of existence in ways that made simple action or decision-making nearly impossible. Understanding your specific vision type is crucial because each requires different approaches to what Jung called vision integration without vision loss. But first, you need to understand why Jung considered this discovery so terrifying. Because Jung observed the devastating effects of dangerous vision on individual psychological well-being and capacity for normal human functioning. Therefore, he concluded that extraordinary perception without proper integration posed genuine dangers to both personal sanity and social connection. Jung identified 3 specific dangers that made this discovery so terrifying. Danger 1. Existential isolation through superior perception. Jung wrote, "The individual who sees too much becomes separated from collective human experience, not by choice, but by the inevitable consequence of perceiving realities that others cannot access or validate. When visionaries consistently see truths that others deny or ignore, they become psychologically isolated in a reality that feels completely alien to normal human consciousness. Jung observed that people with dangerous vision often developed what he called perception paranoia, not because their visions were false, but because living with accurate perception of hidden realities made them feel constantly surrounded by deception, denial, and unconsciousness that others seemed unable or unwilling to recognize. This isolation wasn't just social, but existential. These individuals often felt like they were living in a different universe from everyone around them, seeing a reality that others couldn't perceive and being unable to find validation or companionship in their perceptual experience. Danger 2, paralysis through overwhelming awareness. Jung documented how dangerous vision could become so comprehensive that it paralyzed decision-making and action. When individuals could see too many patterns, outcomes, and consequences simultaneously, they often became unable to choose any course of action because they were overwhelmed by awareness of complexity and interconnectedness. Jung wrote, "The curse of seeing too much is that every choice becomes weighted with awareness of vast consequences. Every relationship reveals layers of complexity that make simple engagement impossible, and every action carries knowledge of outcomes that may be undesirable but unavoidable." These visionaries would become frozen by their own perception, unable to move forward because they could see too clearly the challenges, disappointments, and complications that lay ahead. They knew too much about what they were getting into to engage with normal human optimism or naivety. Danger 3, the prophet's madness. Most terrifyingly, Jung found that individuals with dangerous vision often developed what he called Cassandra syndrome, being cursed with accurate perception of future disasters while being powerless to convince others to avoid them or prepare for them. Jung wrote, "Nothing is more maddening than possessing accurate knowledge about preventable disasters while being dismissed as negative, delusional, or manipulative by those who most need to hear the warnings." These individuals would watch helplessly as people they cared about made choices that would lead to exactly the disasters the visionaries had foreseen. Over time, this dynamic created profound psychological torment as visionaries learned that their perception was both accurate and useless. They could see what was coming, but couldn't prevent it, creating a sense of helpless responsibility for suffering they witnessed but couldn't stop. This is why Jung considered the integration of dangerous vision not just therapeutically important, but psychologically urgent. Because unintegrated extraordinary perception posed such dangers to individual sanity and social functioning, therefore Jung developed what he called the vision burden integration process, a systematic approach to maintaining visionary abilities while protecting psychological well-being and social connection. Phase 1. Acceptance of vision without identification with vision. Jung taught his visionary patients to first recognize that their extraordinary perception was an ability they possessed rather than their total identity. He called this vision sovereignty, maintaining clear boundaries between their visionary insights and their personal selfhood. Jung wrote, "The visionary must learn to hold their perceptions lightly, recognizing that seeing clearly does not make them responsible for what they see or obligated to fix what they perceive." Technique. Jung instructed visionaries to practice what he called witness consciousness, observing their visions with detachment rather than becoming emotionally overwhelmed by the content of what they perceived. He taught them to distinguish between accurate perception and personal responsibility, understanding that seeing future disasters didn't make them responsible for preventing them, and perceiving others' shadow contents didn't obligate them to heal or expose those unconscious elements. Phase 2, selective vision sharing based on readiness assessment. Jung discovered that visionaries who shared their insights indiscriminately often experienced constant rejection and dismissal that amplified their isolation. Instead, he taught what he called vision discernment, carefully assessing whether others were psychologically ready to receive visionary insights before sharing them. Jung wrote, "The integrated visionary learns not to suppress their visions, but to share them strategically with individuals who have demonstrated capacity for receiving difficult truths without becoming defensive or dismissive." Jung instructed his patients to develop sophisticated assessment skills for determining when their visions would be helpful versus when they would be rejected or cause harm. He emphasized that protecting their visionary abilities sometimes meant keeping insights private rather than attempting to convince others who weren't ready to receive them. Phase 3, vision as service rather than burden. The final phase involved what Jung called sacred vision integration, using extraordinary perception in service of conscious evolution, rather than viewing it as a personal curse or burden. Jung wrote, "The fully integrated visionary recognizes that their dangerous gift serves a larger evolutionary purpose. They become scouts for collective consciousness, perceiving realities that will eventually need to be recognized and integrated by broader humanity." This required developing what Jung called evolutionary perspective, understanding that their visions serve not just personal awareness, but collective development, helping prepare for changes and challenges that humanity would eventually need to face consciously. Because Jung understood that dangerous vision could either destroy individuals through isolation and overwhelm or transform them into evolutionary servants. Therefore, he studied both successful and unsuccessful cases to understand what determined whether visionaries integrated their abilities or were destroyed by them. The case of unintegrated vision destruction, Jung documented several patients whose dangerous vision ultimately led to complete psychological breakdown. One case involved an individual who had accurately predicted a series of family tragedies, but had been dismissed and rejected when trying to warn others. After the predictions came to pass exactly as foreseen, this person developed what Jung called prophet's despair, complete loss of faith in human consciousness and withdrawal from all social connection. Jung wrote, "The patient's visions proved consistently accurate, but their inability to find anyone capable of receiving these insights led to profound alienation from humanity itself. They began to view ordinary consciousness as a form of collective insanity from which they were tragically excluded." These cases represented what Jung saw as the complete failure of vision integration. Individuals whose extraordinary perception became a source of madness rather than wisdom, because they couldn't find ways to use their abilities constructively. The case of integrated vision service. Jung extensively studied historical figures who had successfully integrated dangerous vision into evolutionary service. He was particularly influenced by individuals like the mystic Jakob Böhme, whom Jung considered an example of successfully integrated visionary consciousness. Böhme possessed what Jung called cosmic vision, the ability to perceive spiritual and psychological realities that transcended ordinary human awareness. But unlike visionaries who were destroyed by their perception, Böhme channeled his insights into wisdom teachings that helped others develop their own capacity for expanded awareness. Jung wrote, "Böhme transformed his dangerous gift of seeing too much into a bridge between ordinary consciousness and expanded awareness. He used his visions not to separate himself from humanity, but to serve humanity's evolutionary development toward greater consciousness." Jung noted that Böhme's success came from what he called humble service, using extraordinary perception to support others' growth rather than to prove his own superiority or to force unwanted insights on unprepared minds. Jung's own vision integration journey Most significantly, Jung documented his own struggle with dangerous vision during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious from 1913 to 1919. Jung wrote, "I found myself perceiving psychological and archetypal realities that seemed to have no connection to ordinary human experience. I could see patterns in human behavior and collective development that felt both profound and terrifying." Jung's breakthrough came when he realized that his extraordinary perceptions weren't signs of mental illness, but previews of psychological territories that humanity would eventually need to explore. He wrote, "I learned to view my dangerous visions not as personal burdens, but as evolutionary reconnaissance, scouting expeditions into regions of consciousness that collective humanity was not yet ready to explore." Mighty. This realization transformed his approach to both his own visionary experiences and his work with other visionaries, moving from viewing extraordinary perception as psychological pathology to recognizing it as evolutionary advance work. Because individuals with dangerous vision often struggle to find others who can understand or validate their perceptual experiences. Therefore, Jung emphasized the crucial importance of finding what he called vision companions, others capable of engaging with extraordinary perception without fear or dismissal. Jung wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, "The visionary individual must seek out others who have developed sufficient consciousness to appreciate extraordinary perception without being threatened by it." Jung identified three essential types of relationships for visionaries. Type 1, fellow integrated visionaries. Jung wrote, "The integrated visionary recognizes another integrated visionary immediately. There is a quality of perceptual depth and evolutionary service that creates instant recognition and relief from the isolation of extraordinary perception." These connections often happen through recognition of shared commitment to using vision for evolutionary service rather than personal advantage. With fellow visionaries, you can share the most unusual perceptions without fear of being dismissed as crazy or negative. Type 2, consciousness development seekers. Jung observed that people actively engaged in expanding their own awareness through therapy, spiritual practice, or psychological study could often appreciate visionary insights without feeling threatened by them. They might not possess extraordinary perception themselves, but they understood its value and could engage with visionary insights as opportunities for learning rather than threats to their worldview. Jung wrote, "Those who seek to expand consciousness can bear to encounter consciousness that has already expanded beyond conventional limits." Type 3, evolutionary servants. Jung identified individuals who, while they might not possess visionary abilities themselves, were committed to serving human development and consciousness evolution. These people could appreciate visionary insights when they supported broader evolutionary purposes. The recognition process. Jung developed specific indicators for identifying safe relationships for visionaries. They demonstrate curiosity about unusual perceptions rather than immediately dismissing them as impossible. They can tolerate uncertainty and complexity rather than requiring simple explanations for everything. They show genuine interest in consciousness, development, and human evolution, rather than only focusing on conventional success and social conformity. They maintain emotional stability when confronted with difficult truths, rather than becoming defensive or aggressive. Gradual revelation protocol. Jung taught visionaries a careful process for sharing their abilities. 1. Begin with minor insights to assess their receptivity. 2. Observe whether they become curious or defensive when presented with unusual perceptions. 3. Evaluate whether they can handle complex or contradictory information without becoming overwhelmed. 4. Gradually share deeper visions based on their demonstrated capacity for receiving extraordinary insights. 5. Always frame visions as offerings for consideration rather than absolute pronouncements. Jung emphasized, the goal is not to find people who accept every vision uncritically, but to find people who can engage with extraordinary perception as valuable input for understanding reality more completely. Because integrated dangerous vision serves both individual development and collective consciousness evolution, therefore, Jung viewed successful vision integration as essential not just for personal well-being, but for humanity's psychological and spiritual development. Jung wrote in The Undiscovered Self, the individual who learns to see clearly without being overwhelmed by what they see serves as an advanced scout for collective consciousness development. They perceive realities that the collective will eventually need to recognize and integrate. He believed that individuals who successfully integrate dangerous vision become what he called consciousness pioneers, people who help prepare humanity for evolutionary developments that are approaching but not yet obvious to ordinary awareness. The 4 stages of vision integration. Stage 1. Acceptance without overwhelm. The first transformation occurs when visionaries learn to acknowledge their extraordinary perception without being crushed by the weight of what they see. Jung called this vision courage, the ability to see clearly without losing hope or sanity. Jung wrote, "The beginning of vision integration is recognizing that seeing difficult truths is a gift rather than a curse, and that bearing witness to reality serves evolution even when it cannot prevent suffering." Stage 2. Discernment without suppression. The second stage involves learning to share visions wisely while maintaining the full capacity for extraordinary perception. Jung called this sacred discernment, using vision to serve others' growth without overwhelming them with more truth than they can integrate. Jung observed, the integrated visionary learns not to see less, but to share more consciously, offering insights that support development rather than creating defensive reactions. Stage 3. Service without martyrdom. The third transformation happens when visionaries learn to use their perception in service of evolution without sacrificing their own well-being or becoming consumed by others' unconsciousness. Jung called this evolutionary service, using vision to support collective development while maintaining personal psychological health. Jung wrote, "The privilege of dangerous vision is to serve consciousness evolution not through personal sacrifice, but through conscious demonstration of what expanded awareness looks like in practice." Stage 4. Wisdom without attachment. The final stage involves what Jung called transcendent vision, using extraordinary perception to contribute to collective awakening without attachment to whether others recognize, accept, or act on visionary insights. Jung observed, the fully
which Jung recognized
integrated
as integration
visionary
failure
works for evolutionary
disguised as
development
psychological wisdom.
rather than personal recognition, offering their perceptions as gifts to collective consciousness without requiring immediate acceptance or understanding. And the integration becomes evolutionary medicine. Jung believed that individuals who successfully integrate dangerous vision serve a vital evolutionary function for human consciousness development. They see what collective awareness is not yet ready to recognize, helping prepare humanity for necessary developmental steps. Jung wrote, "What is not brought to consciousness comes to us as fate." Visionaries who learn integration help make unconscious evolutionary pressures conscious before they manifest destructively in collective behavior. But Jung warned about specific pitfalls that can derail vision integration. Because the path of integrating dangerous vision contains specific challenges, therefore, Jung documented the most common ways visionaries sabotage their own integration process. Pitfall 1. The superiority inflation trap. Jung wrote extensively about visionaries who became identified with their extraordinary perception as evidence of spiritual superiority rather than evolutionary responsibility. In the relations between the ego and the unconscious, he warned, the danger is that the visionary identifies with their gift rather than serving through it, leading to inflation that separates them from the humanity they are meant to serve. Visionaries who fell into this trap would become arrogant about their perceptual abilities, dismissive of ordinary consciousness, and preachy about what they saw. Jung observed, the moment a visionary believes their perception makes them superior to others, they have lost the humility necessary for true evolutionary service. Pitfall 2, the Burden-Martyrdom Complex. Jung documented cases where visionaries used their extraordinary perception to justify self-pity and withdrawal from life. Engagement. They would convince themselves that seeing too much made them victims of their own gifts, which Jung recognized as spiritual immaturity disguised as sensitive suffering. Jung wrote, true vision integration requires taking responsibility for how one uses extraordinary perception, not viewing it as a burden imposed by fate or genetics. Pitfall 3, the prophet addiction. Jung observed that some visionaries became addicted to the drama and attention that came from making predictions and sharing unusual insights. They would begin to exaggerate or fabricate visions to maintain their role as special perceivers. Jung warned, when vision becomes identity rather than service, the person disappears behind their perceptual abilities. This is not integration, but its opposite, the sacrifice of personal development to the inflation of extraordinary perception. Pitfall 4, the isolation justification. Even successfully integrated visionaries could regress into using their perception to justify complete withdrawal from ordinary human engagement during periods of stress or disappointment. They would convince themselves that others were too unconscious to relate to, which Jung recognized as spiritual superiority masquerading as wise discernment. Jung emphasized, integration requires engagement with ordinary consciousness, not escape from it. The integration maintenance. Jung developed ongoing practices for maintaining healthy vision integration. Regular grounding practices to maintain connection with ordinary reality alongside extraordinary perception. Conscious assessment of when to share visions versus when to hold them privately for processing. Ongoing humility practices to prevent inflation about perceptual abilities. Connection with other integrated visionaries for reality checking and mutual support. Service activities that channel vision into practical assistance for collective development. Jung wrote, the integrated visionary does not achieve perfect perception, but learns to dance consciously with extraordinary awareness while maintaining compassionate engagement with ordinary human consciousness. Because Jung understood dangerous vision within the context of collective consciousness evolution, therefore, he viewed visionaries as serving an essential function for human psychological and spiritual development. In The Undiscovered Self, Jung wrote, the individual who sees beyond current collective limitations serves as a bridge between what humanity is and what it is becoming. He believed that people with integrated, dangerous vision serve as what he called evolutionary advanced scouts. Individuals whose perceptual development provides templates for expanded awareness that will eventually benefit all of humanity. The historical pattern. Jung observed that throughout history, individuals with extraordinary vision often appeared before collective consciousness was ready to integrate their perceptions. They served as early warning systems and developmental previews for psychological territories that humanity would eventually need to explore. Jung wrote, What appears in the integrated visionary first as personal perception later manifests in the collective as expanded awareness, improved decision-making, and greater recognition of interconnected patterns that require conscious attention. Modern manifestations. Jung believed that in the modern era, individuals with dangerous vision might be perceiving patterns that explain environmental and social sustainability challenges before they become obvious. Technological implications that others haven't considered. Psychological developments that collective consciousness will need to integrate, and evolutionary pressures that are building toward major consciousness shifts. Jung's insight. The visionary individual feels the future pressing into the present first and most intensely. Their personal perceptions often preview what the entire collective will eventually need to see and integrate for continued development. The service without suffering. Jung's crucial insight was that dangerous vision serves evolution best when it's integrated consciously rather than suffered as a burden. The goal isn't to be tortured by extraordinary perception, but to become a bridge between current reality and evolutionary possibility. Jung wrote, "The integrated visionary serves collective development not by carrying the weight of unwanted knowledge, but by demonstrating how expanded awareness can be held lightly and used wisely in service of consciousness evolution." The ultimate integration. At the highest level of development, Jung observed that individuals with dangerous vision learn to hold their perceptions as sacred trust rather than personal burden, seeing clearly without being overwhelmed, perceiving truly without being isolated, and serving evolution without being consumed by what they witness. Jung called this the transcendent visionary function, using extraordinary perception to contribute to collective awakening naturally, without forcing insights on unprepared minds or suffering in isolation, simply by embodying expanded awareness in service of human development. Remember Jung's patient from 1918, the woman who saw endings before they began. After 6 years of working with Jung's vision integration process, her life transformed completely. She learned to hold her visions as evolutionary service rather than personal burden. She found ways to use her insights to help others who were ready for expanded awareness. She built relationships with people who could appreciate her perceptual gifts without feeling threatened by them. Most importantly, she stopped experiencing her dangerous vision as a curse that separated her from humanity and began understanding it, as Jung called, a sacred responsibility to serve consciousness evolution through expanded awareness. Jung wrote about her transformation. The patient learned not to see less clearly, but to see more wisely, not to suppress her visions, but to share them as evolutionary service rather than personal demonstration. Her gift remained intact, but her relationship to it became integrated service rather than isolated burden. This represents Jung's most terrifying discovery about dangerous vision. That extraordinary perception without conscious integration becomes a psychological prison that separates visionaries from human connection and condemns them to witness suffering they cannot prevent. And this isolation will either drive them to madness through overwhelmed consciousness or transform them into exactly what humanity needs for its evolutionary development. Integrated scouts for collective consciousness expansion. You're dangerous. Gift of seeing too much isn't a psychological disorder or spiritual burden. It's an evolutionary advance in consciousness development. You're not cursed because you see what others miss. You're responsible for learning to use what you see in service of collective awakening rather than personal torment. The question isn't whether you should suppress your visionary abilities to fit into ordinary consciousness. The question is whether you'll develop the integration skills necessary to transform dangerous vision into evolutionary service. Jung's vision integration method offers a path from overwhelmed perception to conscious service, from isolated vision to evolutionary contribution, from personal burden to collective gift. You were born to see clearly, not to suffer in isolation, but to serve consciousness evolution through integrated wisdom. The world needs your visionary abilities, but it needs them channeled through wisdom, discernment, and service that transforms dangerous perception into evolutionary medicine. Your gift of seeing too much is not your curse. Your unintegrated relationship to extraordinary vision is your challenge. Learn to integrate it consciously, and you become exactly what Jung believed integrated visionaries were meant to be: consciousness. Pioneers preparing humanity for evolutionary developments that are inevitable but not yet obvious to ordinary awareness. Jung's most terrifying discovery about dangerous vision wasn't that some people see too much. It's that most people who possess extraordinary perception never learn to use it wisely, remaining isolated by gifts that could serve human evolution if integrated consciously. The terror isn't in seeing clearly, it's in failing to develop the integration wisdom that transforms visionary burden into evolutionary service. You are not overwhelmed by too much awareness. You are exactly what consciousness evolution requires. Once you learn to hold your vision as lightly and wisely as Jung learned to hold his psychological insights. If you recognize yourself in Jung's description of the dangerously gifted visionary, you're part of a rare group that Jung believed essential for consciousness evolution. Share in the comments what type of dangerous vision you experience. Your integration journey connects with others walking the same path from overwhelmed perception to evolutionary service. Subscribe for more insights into Jung's discoveries about consciousness development that transcends ordinary human limitations. If you're ready to explore more of Jung's insights about extraordinary perception and its integration, check out my video on Jung's most dangerous discovery about prophetic abilities, where I reveal the specific practices visionaries need to transform overwhelming perception into wisdom that serves collective awakening. Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension.